The news and opinions expressed on Occupy Radio may not necessarily reflect the views of KWVA Eugene, the University of Oregon, or the Associated Students of the University of Oregon.
From KWVA in Eugene and the Occupy Eugene Media Group, this is Occupy Radio, an extended conversation about the issues which gave rise to the Occupy movement. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierra Lupe.
Even if there's a full-blown revolution, let's say that these people get their way, the way that you're going to end that revolution, the violence of that revolution, is by creating a new Constitution. We are modern people. We're much more advanced. We don't have to tear each other apart over politics. Let's just skip that whole revolution part and just get down to the business of figuring out our direction.
In America, corporations are people and money is speech. In American elections, voters are crowded out by dollars. Do you miss your freedom of speech or protections against unreasonable search, seizures, and imprisonment? You can join the growing tumult in the streets, or you can get constitutional. Dan Marks of ArticleV.org says we have everything in place to call an Article 5 constitutional convention, and he's pushing Congress to make it happen. Change the Constitution this week on Occupy Radio. Howdy, occupiers, and welcome to Occupy Radio. I'm going to talk about having a plan today, occupiers. My guest, Dan Marks, has a plan, and I have a plan. I think it's always a good idea to have a plan. I mean, corporate America has a plan. Homeland Security has a plan. When we march in the streets, occupiers, the cops who meet us, they have a plan. The corporate-backed politicians filling our government have a plan. It's corporate America's plan, but at least they have one. Clearly, the Tea Party has a plan, and again, it's corporate America's plan, but it helps them put their thoughts in order and decide what to do next. We're occupying because we don't like other people's plans. We didn't like the bank's plans to take all of our money or the corporation's plans to take everything else. We didn't like our government's plan to take our freedom, to stop the banks and the corporations' plans. We saw all of these plans coming together and breaking our country, and we didn't like what we saw. So our plan was to do something dramatic and draw everybody's attention to the terrible stuff that was going on as part of all these bad plans, and we've done that. But then more terrible stuff started happening somewhere else, so we marched down there and waved signs and pointed at that terrible stuff until people around it started paying attention. Occupy has gotten very good at pointing out terrible stuff. We helped amplify Keystone XL, Manning, NDAA, NSA, the looting of the middle class. Occupy, we can safely say, derailed the corporate class's austerity plans for the United States. We put ourselves between the bad stuff and the good stuff we're trying to protect. That's a good plan, and we got to do it. Find out where the bad stuff is going on, get in front of the bad stuff, and say stop. It's a tough fight, occupiers, and I love the people who are doing it. Now, as awesome and as necessary as all of the holding actions are all around the world, they don't address what comes next. All of these heroic holding actions have to keep on going. The corporate machine is going to keep on grinding away unless we stop it. But what if we do stop it? What comes next? Why does everybody have a plan but us, occupiers? If our plan is to stop the bad stuff from happening, then our plan requires that the bad stuff keep happening. Wrap your head around that one, occupiers. If your mission statement is stop bad stuff from happening, then bad stuff happening is pretty much your mission statement. If bad stuff isn't happening, your mission statement is stop. I'm not saying we have to stop stopping bad things, occupiers. I'm just saying it's time we have a plan that extends beyond stopping things. It's time we stop focusing on the plans we disagree with and start forming plans we can all get behind. A constitutional convention, occupiers, is a mighty intriguing plan. Dan Marks is here to tell us all about it. Dan Marks is president of ArticleV.org, a group which is focused on calling an Article 5 convention to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. Dan joined Joe and I on the show back in January. We talked about a right-wing plot to hold an Article 5 convention and pass a balanced budget amendment. What we didn't talk about, though, was the Article 5 convention itself. We didn't get in-depth talking about all the states getting together and adding to our Constitution. Well, Dan popped up again on People Rise Up Radio, Tuesdays on Occupy the Media. He popped up about a month ago calling for an Article 5 convention. We've traded a few emails since then, and I decided to bring all of you occupiers back into the conversation. Welcome to Occupy Radio, Dan, and thanks for joining the show.
Aloha, Getch. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here once again. Got some very exciting news this week.
That is what I like. That makes good shows, exciting news. So I'm all for it. I'm all for it. But let's hold off on that exciting news for just a little bit because, we want to keep the audience interested. But let's start with ArticleV.org, which I guess Article 5 is the other way to talk about it. And that is where you are about to make a big splash, right?
We hope so. First, let's start with what Article 5 is. The Article 5 Constitution is the part of the Constitution which explains how we amend the Constitution, propose amendments to it. And inside of that very small article of the Constitution is a passage, and I'll read it to you here real quick, that the Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. And once they propose those amendments, it will go out to the states, ratify those amendments. Basically, what we're working on, what we're hoping to trigger is basically a great big meeting, and it could take months, it could take a couple of years to finish, but mostly what it does, well, all that it does is propose amendments to the Constitution for states to consider, just like Congress does, except this time there's no Congress in it. And the only power that Congress would have in this case would be that they still get to choose the method of ratification. They would choose either ratification conventions in each of these states, which they've done once before, or what they've normally done is just send it through state legislatures for them to adopt these amendments or not. And they're very good at disposing of amendments. We've had so many amendments come through, and now we're talking about only 27, 28 amendments to the Constitution since its beginning. So it's very hard to amend the Constitution.
So you're talking about a process, Dan, that's going to sidestep Congress? I just can't see how anybody's going to want to embrace that because, Congress is so popular right now.
Right. It's amazing that the Congress could be. I just saw it on the news yesterday that their popularity has dropped to 5%. And it really struck me because at what point do they lose their legitimacy? If we knew that Russia had the support of only 5% of its people, their government, wouldn't we just be shaking our heads and thinking, why don't they do something about this? How can they get their government back? And our forefathers had gone through revolution, and they were wise enough to put a peaceful method of change in the Constitution where we, the people, can assemble and direct the course of our future, control our own destinies, and form the country that we want.
I like that the Congress's approval rating has dropped below UFOs. More people believe in UFOs than believe they can trust Congress now.
Yeah, we're pretty much within the margin of error of zero. So it's hard to imagine a point in history where they would have less support than they do right now. The American Revolution was, I don't think it had the support of 50% of America, but we were strong enough and brave enough to control our own destinies then. It took a militating event like the Boston Massacre or something like that to get it going. And hopefully we don't see something like that happen. Hopefully we have a much more peaceful course to take.
Well, yeah, I am fully in favor of that. That's what you're proposing here, is that we use the mechanisms of government to actually accomplish something for the people.
Right. Surprisingly enough, if you want systemic change, you're going to have to amend the Constitution. You're going to have to get these things in writing and get them accepted to make those changes. I know there's a lot of people out there that would say, oh, come on, it's just the Constitution. Nobody pays attention to that. And there are people in America, I hear it all the time. They think that we don't have any choice but to start throwing rocks or some other nonviolent act. And that's not the way. We're not going to win that way. The only way, even if there's a full-blown revolution, let's say that these people get their way, the way that you're going to end that revolution, the violence of that revolution, is by creating a new constitution. We are modern people. We're much more advanced. We don't have to tear each other apart over politics. Let's just skip that whole revolution part and just get down to the business of figuring out our direction.
I like the way you're thinking. I actually gave kind of a rant very similar to that last week on the show. So you and I are definitely coming at this from the same direction. And I like the idea that once all the shooting and bloodshed and mayhem is done, anytime you're trying to change the course of a government through violence, you still have to get down to the paperwork and you still have to write down your agreements. And nothing is settled until that happens. So you're right. Let's bypass the shooting. Let's bypass the carnage.
We can acknowledge that our government is broken. People say, well, gosh, what do we do if our government is really this broken? Obviously, we need to have this kind of convention. And it seems as though Congress is obstructing this convention over the years because we've never had this kind of convention in our nation's history. We had the original Constitutional Convention in 1789, but we've never had an Article 5 convention, which isn't a full-blown constitutional convention. It keeps the framework and everything else intact. It only allows amendments to it, and those amendments are only limited to we can't infringe upon the equal suffrage of the states in the Senate. So it's like the original Constitutional Convention, but it has these training wheels where it keeps us from completely losing our system. But honestly, it's been so long that every single article will be scrutinized. There's been enough theory and discussion by academics of these very arcane passages and phrases that we're really going to have to examine a lot of these. And what we see right now with the Supreme Court ruling, with the McCutcheon ruling, they are exploiting the loopholes of definitions in the Constitution. Some of the problems that we have in our political system right now could easily be changed by just defining what a person is, defining what speech is, and really we as a people need to do that. We shouldn't be allowing Congress to make this decision because it's beyond them. They are immersed in the system that is driving us over this cliff right now.
I want to make sure that everybody understands what it is you and I are talking about. And what we are talking about is the mechanism for calling all the states together to decide what specific changes to make in the Constitution going forward. But now this is different than a straight-up constitutional convention then. Like in a constitutional convention, we'd be saying that was a nice constitution in its day, we're going for something new. Is that the case? And an Article 5 convention is saying is, we like what we got, we just have to clarify a few points.
For the most part, that's right. There are some distinctions there that in Mark Levin, he's got this very popular book, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks on end here, the Liberty Amendments. He's also pushing an Article 5 convention, but he is coming from a standpoint that it is a convention of state legislatures, and that is not the case. This is, and it's a subtle distinction, but it's an important distinction, and I don't really like the jargon that he's using for that, because this is not a convention of the states. The states are requesting a convention in their applications, and then delegates are elected to go serve at this convention, and it's up to them to decide what the agenda is and how they will vote on certain things. They may choose to amend an amendment suggestion that comes up in the convention, and that's perfectly okay. It's supposed to be a deliberative process. I was pursuing this avenue of an Article 5 convention before Occupy sprung up, and that was one of the first things that really drew me into Occupy was when the General Assemblies were set up in New York City and different cities around the country. It seemed to me that Occupy was emulating a convention where they were basically saying, everybody come on down, let's talk about our problems and how we're going to solve them. They worked on consensus, and the convention also works on consensus, where people come and deliberate, and it takes 66% in a convention to pass. And that's a very high threshold, just like the Occupy model. And it really struck me, the similarities. And I knew that when the people came spilling out into the streets and complaining about corporate domination of our electoral system and the way that they were approaching this problem, I knew that these are my people. I identified immediately with them. And I think that if you like the Occupy model, you should really embrace the convention model as well, because that's in essence what it is we send people to this convention to deliberate, propose ideas. It takes consensus to pass, and then it still takes 75% of the states to adopt those ideas. And that is a very high threshold. So coming up with ideas that the states will dispose of is not the problem. The problem is finding a source of ideas to reform our government and allowing states to consider those changes. We can do a lot.
I like the idea of comparing Occupy to constitutional conventions. I don't know if that's exactly the terminology that's correct, but I just like that idea because I think a lot of people these days are looking at Occupy and wondering, okay, what's next? And what form is it going to take? You know, we know that there's a significant percentage of the population who want something to change, but when we all got together for Occupy, we still didn't have an idea of how to address the need for change. We just knew that it was time to get out there and make sure everybody understood we wanted the change.
Right.
So that could be a very powerful new movement, is the Constitutional Convention movement. And the advantage it would have is you're giving people a very clear outlet for their angst.
Right. And if you're going to elect these people, nominate delegates to a convention, you're going to be picking people you choose with the future of your grandchildren, not just the next 4 years till the next election or whatever. These are going to be basically permanent changes. Of course, you can always repeal an amendment, but these are basically permanent changes. And they're more philosophical. And we find that in this kind of format, the farther you get away from the middle, the less likely an idea has a chance of succeeding. It needs to have an overwhelming amount of support. So, if you're going to change the system, again, it's not just Occupy system, or it doesn't belong to the Democrats or the Republicans. It belongs to Americans, and it needs to have that opportunity for people to come and meet face to face and roll up your sleeves and address these problems as human beings instead of lobbying sound bites through the media at each other. This is an opportunity that will be amazing, and in modern times, in such a large country, the spotlight will be white hot. The delegate that you voted for or somebody else voted for, the amount of scrutiny that will be placed on this convention, you'll know when your delegate is going to the bathroom. It will be that amazing, the amount of coverage that this kind of thing will get. So it's going to be transparent. It's not going to be a backroom deal. And then even when it's over, you need that deliberation part of it because you want to get it exactly right so that when it goes out to the states, you don't get just this red state versus blue state effect. You need to make sure that when you have freedom of religion, you have freedom of religion for everyone, freedom of speech for everyone, privacy for everyone. And that's the kind of thing that's really going to shine and come out of that kind of convention. Also, I hope we get the kind of simple democratic tools like a referendum, national referendum, maybe recall of senators. Nice. I think with this government shutdown right now, if we had a recall of senators or congressmen, I think that you would see quite a lot of action in a lot of these states right now to get rid of some of these guys. So we really need the modern democratic tools that most countries in some states have access to. There's no reason in a modern democracy that we can't have simple direct democracy, or we can make these changes. The Constitution, the philosophies of it are great and should be carried through, but really, let's face it, it's very old. We need to update it. It's overdue. Every generation has their amendment that they put their fingerprints on it somehow, and we need to do it in a big way. The urgency that our planet faces in so many different respects, we just don't have the luxury of time to wait for election after election to start piecemealing changes and repairs to our system. We need a lot of holistic changes quickly.
We don't have time to wait, especially when each time we do vote, nothing gets done, and nothing's really been, getting done for quite some time. Now, you tell me that you are also, in regards to this process, a very singular individual in a historical sense.
Yes, this year I became the first person in U.S. history to make an official formal request from both houses of Congress as to where we are with the official tally of applications from state legislatures for an Article 5 convention. And oddly enough, they've never been asked this before. They've never provided Americans with a list of states that have applied, what applications they've done, and there's no official count as to how many states have done it, which states are in the applied column, which states are in the not applied column. So what I did is I called up the clerk of House and the Congressional Research Service, and the House parliamentarian, Tom Wickham, was especially helpful in April. He set up a process which doesn't exist in our system and told me to write up a letter, basically how to make this request. And I noted on there that Tom Wickham instructed me to do this, the parliamentarian. And I turned that into the clerk of House, and I said, we need to have an official tally because there's a lot of disagreement among a lot of different political groups that are interested in the convention method. They're going around right now in different states and getting applications, fresh applications, but there's no time limit on these things. They don't expire unless there's a sunset clause written into them. They don't expire. And it doesn't matter if they match up. The amendments that they support are irrelevant. There are suggestions to the delegates. Again, what the states are applying for is the convention, not the amendment. So what I did is I went through the congressional record with the help of the research of Friends of Article 5 Convention. They, within the last 10 years, put together a collection of the applications of the different states that were recorded in the congressional record. And they came up with well over 5 to 700, depending on how you look at it, applications from state legislatures, and basically from all 50 states at one point had made an Article 5 application in one form or another. And I went through there with the perspective that was laid out by former Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, Thomas Brennan, his standard of judging these applications. I went through and counted up the states and came up with a list of 42 states with legal standing applications. And it only takes 34 states to trigger the convention right now. That's 2/3.
You might be interested, occupiers, in knowing what Article 5 of the United States Constitution says, so I'll read it for you. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any matter affect the first and fourth clauses of the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. You're listening to Occupy Radio from KWVA Eugene and the Pacifica Radio Network, streaming at kwvaradio.org and podcasting at occupythemedia.podomatic.com. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierra Lupe. We're back with Dan Marks of ArticleV.org, and we're talking about the pathway toward calling an Article 5 convention for amending the United States Constitution. We've got the numbers. Every single state has applied for such a convention. By every measurement, Dan expects to be able to meet the standard of 2/3 of the states calling for a convention, but he still has to overcome a do-nothing Congress, ALEC, and ultimately Google. I want to clarify something here, Dan. So what you're saying is it doesn't matter why any individual state has asked for a convention. That's immaterial to this process. And
Right.
so all you need is to find out that enough states have asked for it and that their request is still legally valid. And
Right.
given those two hurdles, we should be able to call for an Article 5 convention.
Right. We've never had an official count, and it's quite a rabbit hole. And when I first learned about the convention clause, it was like, this is exactly what we need. We need a way to go around Congress and propose amendments. What I didn't expect when I started down this road was that I would find this record of all of these states that had applied. And, when we went into Occupy, our group originally was called the Inter-Occupy Article 5 Work Group. We were a bunch of people in Occupy scattered throughout the country. And we joined this group because we realized, for the most part, Occupy is a defensive reaction to this list of grievances that we have. And we understood that there was this method out there to go on offense, and that's exactly what we were doing. And we had reviewed this list of applications to figure out really which states do we tell Occupy we need to focus on, because then we can get the applications from those states, and then we're well on our way. So really we had to figure out, where are we starting from? And when we looked at it, and we not only applied this Chief Justice's view of it, but other perspectives, do they have to be the same subject? Some people say they do. So if we count up the same subject applications, gosh darn it, we still passed the number of 34. Well, how about if they have to be contemporaneous? Do they have to be during the same time period? And then in the 1960s, we find that during a 7-year period, there were over 160 applications that came in. And so, any way we looked at this, we determined that the states have crossed this threshold, and it's really the obligation. It's a peremptory duty of Congress to acknowledge these applications and call the convention to order now. And that means we don't have to go from state to state and get brand new applications. That's spinning our wheels. This was almost by design. So anyway, we turn this in, and they write back that there's no count. There's never been a count because they never assigned the duty to count. And I knew this. In the 1970s, they tried 22 times in Congress to pass a bill that would set up some additional structure to an Article 5 convention and would have assigned the duty in Congress to an office to tabulate these things and keep track and tell everyone. But all 22 times it failed. So as I look back through all these applications from throughout our history, I see many times where it looks like Congress should have called a convention but didn't, because there's no department that's in charge of this. And the effect that has on the course of our nation, to think that the right to vote for women or blacks could have come decades sooner, to think that we could have had a convention within years, just a few years of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't think that there's any way that we could say that our world would not be a different place today. I think that what the record is showing us is extremely important. It really undermines the legitimacy of the nation, knowing that this is being obstructed by a simple clerical error that happened in both houses, oddly enough.
As there are so many things of importance in our society today, like, say, reopening the government from a shutdown, the move towards an Article 5 convention is being blocked, apparently, by Congress, whether willfully or in ignorance. Now, you actually have a plan, though, to bring this forward, and you've been kind of sketching it out, but I want to try to nail you down to some specifics now. So where are we going next?
Okay, the request went into the clerk's office in the House. It went to the Senate parliamentarian in the Senate. The Senate parliamentarian called me up and told me herself that she had entered the request into the congressional record herself on August 1st of this year, and now it is a permanent part of our history, and it is going to the Judiciary Committee of the Senate, and it was supposed to be sent by the clerk to the Judiciary Committee, and they had told me that when the recess was over on August 9th, it would be there, but it wasn't. For some reason, the Speaker of the House, Tom Boehner, decided that he had to have it go through his office, and he would forward it to the Judiciary Committee. And I cannot confirm that happened. It looks like he got it to go through his office, the government shut down, and there it stays.
Wait a second. Wait a second here. I'm starting to see a little pattern here. You're telling me, Dan, that here you have all this information that's going to lead us to some new government-defining Article 5 convention, and then the government shuts down? and it's in Boehner's office?
The timing is definitely amazing, and I have not been able to get through because his line is jammed.
I wonder why.
Everybody in the country calling him over the shutdown. But I also called the Judiciary Committee in the House directly, and I told them that this was diverted over to the Speaker's office, and I wanted to confirm that they had received it. They were not aware of this, and were not sure if they had received it or not, but they said, regardless, here's our secret fax number. Please fax that to us. And we just did that. But the clerk had offered to forward it to the Judiciary Committee for me in July, and I took them up on it. And it's strange that they call an audible at the very last minute. And this is definitely not anywhere in process or anything where it would go through the Speaker's office before it would go through a committee. In fact, it's not supposed to go through a committee at all. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 85 that these applications are not subject to the discretion of the members of Congress. Going through a subcommittee or going through Speaker Boehner's office definitely implies some kind of discretion is being applied to these applications that were turned in. And frankly, these are recorded in the congressional record. I know that they're valid. They wouldn't have put them in the congressional record if they were not valid.
So they've already passed some kind of vetting, is what you're saying.
Exactly. That was another point that I had made with one of the legislative aides in the Senate was he had said, well, how are we supposed to verify these things? There's no standard. I argued there was. It was set up by the U.S. Solicitor General. They could call them. But I said, but it's also a two-way street. You're asking to verify something from a state. You could always call the state and say, we just got this application from 1899 from Texas. Is it still valid? And oddly enough, just this year, the state of Texas considered rescinding their application from 1899, but that failed. So I know that Texas would answer, yes, it's still valid.
How did it fail?
They just didn't get the votes to call out a rescission for it.
In the state government?
In the state legislature,
in the
right.
State legislature, okay.
They put the rescission of that application up on the table. The rescission itself is even debatable what they're allowed to do that because it's a constitutional process that they're participating in. It's not legislation per se. Legislation they could repeal or change. This is not legislation. It does not require the signature of the governor. These are state legislators that are participating in a federal process when they do this. And when they do that, there's no legal definition in constitutional law of rescission. So it's a contract law thing. So it's debatable whether they can even do that, but they did consider it and it did fail. So that tells me that the 1899 application is still active and Congress can just verify with the states. They know. They can verify it.
All right. You and I had spoken about other issues surrounding this process. When you were on my show back there with Joe and me back in, I think it was January, was it?
Yeah.
You were talking about how not everybody who wants to use an Article 5 convention is doing it with the best of intentions. And I just want to find out, how are things going along on those lines?
Well, there is a group out there that is pushing for a compact between different states. And what they intend to do is basically take the power within Article 5 and create a new process through an interstate compact, which would select the governors of each state to go and adopt the balanced budget amendment that they wrote. So they failed this last year. They started in the states of Arizona and North Dakota. And I think they fully expected to get the support of those states. But really, the way that they've set up this process, I think makes even the conservative states very nervous. So people should be aware of this compact that plans to use the power of an Article 5 convention. But what they're talking about isn't an actual Article 5 convention. If it was an Article 5 convention, they wouldn't need the compact. This thing is to restrict and just get their own agenda through. And It's got some methods set up in there of pre-ratification, and it may not be acceptable to Congress. It still needs to get the approval of Congress. Any agreement between the states still needs to get the approval of Congress. It's just the way it is, and I doubt that they would approve it, but you never know. You never know these days. So I think it's good to have people aware of it, but knowing that its track record wasn't so great, I wouldn't be terribly concerned about it, but it's good to keep on your radar.
So that particular threat is hopefully maybe still on the radar, but fading into the rearview mirror at the same time.
Yeah, I think that the Mark Levin book takes a lot of the theories from that compact and applies them to an Article 5 convention, which seems to be misplaced. Mark Levin's ideas may be a little bit skewed, but, I think the bottom line is here that these folks also see a way to go around Congress, and they're trying to do it in what they feel is the safest way possible. But I just caution anyone who would try to control a democratic process. Be careful what you wish for, because if we allow the control of something like that, who are we giving it to?
In the case of Google, what do they gain by trying to call for an Article 5 convention?
I have no idea. I'm not exactly sure what Google just teamed up with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. So
that's going to really hurt their do no evil promise.
That is what it really concerns me, is that they've definitely got this method of change on their radar. ALEC wrote the handbook for the Article 5 convention with their own agenda in mind. So some of these ideas are a little bit shaded. I'm trying to be gentle about that too, but
well, that's good. This is public radio.
But still, the action that we're doing in Congress right now, I hope, sorts out a lot of those issues and forces Congress to address how we count these things, how we elect delegates to these. And I know the states are in charge of their own elections, so they can't really tell these states how to do it, but they can at least define how this is set up constitutionally, that there is an election and that the people should be guaranteed an election. It does fall under election law and under the definition of election, a federal law. It does note that their election can be defined as an election of delegates to a convention to amend the United States Constitution or propose amendments to the United States Constitution. But it really is still an ambiguous process. And again, I hope that one of the effects of our action in Congress right now is to force them to address those shortcomings and fill in the gaps so that we know exactly what we're getting into, and that this is managed objectively and transparently. And again, we need the awareness of the people in general out there so that we keep these guys honest. We know how they act, and this is our convention, and we do not want to surrender that power. It's our right to alter or abolish.
What's your vision of the other side of this process? I mean, how do we benefit? What's the payoff?
Knowing that really there's barely any limitation to it. It all starts with a blank sheet of paper. My real hope is that we're going beyond what's politically feasible, and we're talking about what's possible. And that, I don't think that we've even explored the real interesting ideas out there like direct democracy and how that would fit in. But again, I think we can modernize our democracy and give ourselves the tools to get our representation back and amplify our voice in our government to make sure that this is a government that represents us and doesn't rule us. I think that's the ultimate goal here. And how we get there is up to the American people to decide.
And using a process that was put into place specifically to allow us to make that decision. And I want to make sure everybody knows that I am talking with Dan Marks, who is the founder and president of articlev.org, which is focused on the concept of calling an Article 5 convention to hopefully clean up the mess our country has gotten into. And Dan, I want to give you a chance to wrap things up and deliver any closing ideas you have to my audience.
We've talked about a lot. I would just like to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to come on and talk to all the different patriots out there in the Occupy movement and whoever else might be listening. I really think that it's very clear to us our government is broken, and it's time to take a peaceful deliberative approach to make those corrections. And I think that we all have that ability in us. So thanks again for having me on. It was a real pleasure to come on again.
All right. So it sounds like you would join me. I'm calling these days for occupying a demilitarized revolution.
Exactly. I think that we can even scale it down to we really ought to be pushing town halls. More face-to-face resolution of our problems is the best way to go on a national and local level.
I agree with you there, Dan. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the show this week.
All right. Thank you very much.
ArticleV.org is definitely the place to find out more about Dan Marks and the call for an Article V constitutional convention. You're listening to Occupy Radio, occupiers. And if you're not listening live, that means you have found the Occupy the Media podcast. Congratulations and welcome to the show. Now you can get 6 excellent Occupy and social justice podcasts each week. Monday, Mic Check Radio. Tuesday, People Rise Up Radio. Wednesday, Occupied Territory America. Thursday, Talk Nation Radio. Friday, Air Occupy. And every Saturday, listen to yours truly on Occupy Radio. OccupyTheMedia.podomatic.com or search Occupy the Media on iTunes.